So this again is my sense of time, my sense of continuity through time, or identity through time, or redundancy through time. And this sense of identity is a construct. It's my cognitive system is constructing this notion of identity. And so constructing this notion of a stable objecthood. So the thing that the free energy principle is trying to explain, which is the stability of systems through time, that stability itself is a construct, is a theoretical construct. We view it as just a given fact, but it's not.
All right, well, let me just sort of kick this off. And I'll begin by saying, like, introducing myself. I'm John Clippinger, and I'm the host of this First Principles podcast series. And the purpose of this podcast series is really to try to determine if there's a principle basis or science of intelligence, agency, and life, or natural intelligence, synthetic intelligence, collective, institutional culture. Is there a way of a science of understanding these things in a domain and scale-free way? And we've seen a lot going on in sort of in artificial intelligence, generative AI, and the software engineering component of that. But I think the really interesting thing is going on is in the new sciences, the intersection of the sciences, the neuroscience, the physics, the biology. And a lot of this work is coalesced around the concept of active inference and the free energy principle that was first developed by Karl Friston. And I think that given, in my experience, this is an area that I've been interested in better part of my life, many, many years, in both an academic and professionally. There's such activity here. It's not only just activity, it's actually progress, and you can see this field growing in a very powerful way. And I think we're on the cusp of a new kind of scientific paradigm. It is very different than the traditional paradigm we brought up with that we've been conditioned to believe in. And I think part of the effort here is to better to establish the scientific principles, develop a consensus around that, and how that translates into new tools, technologies, and applications. Because I think this new way of thinking, this new science, has amazing positive benefits in addressing the consequential issues of our time. And no one is better suited for a first podcast discussion of first principles than Dr. Chris Fields. Introducing me as a quantum information scientist, Chris brings a unique perspective to our understanding of intelligence and life, and has been highly influential in his collaborations with Karl Friston, Michael Levin, and Donald Hoffman. And I couldn't be more pleased and honored to have Chris as our first guest. Chris, thank
Well,
you.
thank you very much, John, for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, let me start a question here that I want to ask everyone, and that is could you provide a brief overview of what you consider to be the most significant aspects of your research and its implications, and what additional work needs to be done? And I'm going to cheat a little bit here, and I'm going to provide a prompt and say that you shared some work with me on non-reductive explanation, and I'd like to use a prompt from a quote from your a recent paper, the free energy principle for generic quantum systems. And to me, this is an extraordinary quote. It could certainly consume the whole course of the conversation here. But here it goes. We show how generic quantum systems can be regarded as observers, which with the standard freedom of choice assumption becomes agents capable of assigning semantics to observational outcomes. Then you go on to say, we suggest that biological systems employ quantum coherence as a computational resource implicitly as a communications resource. That to me is just is extraordinary framing that's sort of counterintuitive and opens the door to many, many discussions. But so you can take it anywhere you want to take it. But I just to add, I've listened to your lectures. You have a real talent for explaining great complexity and layering it in a very intuitive way. So that I look forward to that.
Okay, well, thank you, John. Um, I suppose I can summarize my research as being directed toward understanding information exchange between systems through the boundary that separates those systems. And the most straightforward case, I always try to work with the most straightforward case, is the case in which we take the entire universe of interest, which we assume to be isolated and so closed, and hence a universe that just includes everything of interest. All the thermodynamic inputs, all the energy that's floating around, any forces that are acting, all of that is part of this universe. And we just cut it in two by imposing a boundary on it. And we ask, what's the interaction defined at that boundary? And again, physics and particularly quantum theory provides a very simple way to characterize this universe that we're talking about, called a Hilbert space. And we can, without losing any generality, think of that Hilbert space as composed of a very large number of binary degrees of freedom. What I mean by that is answers to yes-no questions. John Archibald Wheeler famously talked about the universe as being characterized by yes-no questions by observers such as us or any other observer. So we can think of this universe as just a whole bunch of binary degrees of freedom that can have two values. And that forms a very simple Hilbert space, a space of qubits, quantum bits. And these binary degrees of freedom don't have to be up or down. Each one could be in any combination of up and down. That's what quantum theory gives us instead of classical theory. And so we have a really simple system to think about. So if we draw a boundary across this universe that separates some system that we're interested in and everything else, which we can call its environment, we can ask how the system interacts with its environment. And when we ask that question, we're faced with three basic choices. And the choices are about how big the boundary is compared to the system. So if we think of the system as a bunch of degrees of freedom, and we can ask, in a sense, how close are those degrees of freedom to the boundary? So how involved are those degrees of freedom in the interaction that's going on at the boundary? I mean, you can imagine a system in which the system's pretty small, but its boundary is really enormous. And so all of its degrees of freedom are tightly clustered up against the boundary. So they're highly involved in its interaction with its environment. And you can also imagine a system that's really big, but a boundary that's really small. So the system just barely interacts with its environment. So, you can think of a system that has zillions of degrees of freedom, but its boundary is a tiny, tiny communication pathway that allows it to send a bit back and forth with its environment. So there's almost no interaction at all. So the system can't know anything about its environment. And neither of those are really the case we're interested in. We're interested in systems that have what Karl Friston calls internal degrees of freedom that can have values that don't depend directly on the interaction with the environment. And it's those systems that have those internal degrees of freedom that can do interesting computation. So if we're thinking about systems that communicate with their environments via some boundary, then we're interested in the ones that exhibit some interesting behavior and can do some interesting computation. and so can get information from their boundaries and actually do something with it. So those are the kinds of systems and the kinds of interactions that I spend my time thinking about. And uh, clearly, biological systems are systems like that.
Right.
You can think heuristically of drawing the boundary of a cell, for example, at the cell membrane, or the boundary of a human at their skin. Uh, these boundaries in Hilbert space don't match up with boundaries in geometric space, 3D space. They're actually boundaries in spaces of enormous numbers of dimensions. But just as a kind of thinking tool, we can think of things like the cell membrane as the boundary of a cell. And there's lots and lots of stuff going on in the cell that doesn't directly depend on what's happening on the membrane. It all depends on it eventually, right? What the cell is doing is a lot of processing of information that's arriving across its membrane. And then it's acting on its environment via its membrane. So the membrane's important. It's just not the whole story of what's going on inside the cell. So let me just say one thing about this picture, which I think is important to the free energy principle and thinking about systems in general. And that is that I'll say two things, actually. If you have systems like this that have internal degrees of freedom, and so they're not completely, their behavior is not completely determined by what's happening on their boundary, then these systems have a certain kind of freedom, which is the freedom to assign the semantics they want to the information coming across their boundary. And in physics, we call that the freedom to choose a basis for describing the interaction with the boundary. So a basis meaning a set of vectors that describe what's going on in the Hilbert space. And this is a very fundamental kind of freedom. And there's an important theorem in physics that was published 2 decades ago, probably by Conway and Kochen, called the free will theorem. And the first version of their theorem used mostly reasoning from relativity theory to show that if you have two interacting systems and one of the systems has free will, quote, free will, in the sense that its behavior is not completely determined by what's going on in its past light cone, which means everything that's causally antecedent to it, then the other system that's involved in the interaction isn't completely determined by its past light cone either. And then they strengthen the theorem by not making it relative in this way, but pointing out that if observation obeys some fairly obvious characteristics, that systems are not fully determined by what's going on in their past light cone. Well, you can think of the past light cone as crossing a boundary to get to you, crossing your boundary to influence you. So this is the same kind of freedom that we were talking about earlier. It's a freedom from local determinism. And it characterizes any systems that are statistically independent of their boundaries, conditionally statistically independent of their environments. Sorry.
Right.
And it's this condition that allows systems to be regarded as computing something interesting. And indeed, it's this condition that allows systems to be regarded as having their own states, having states that are determined by them, not determined by their environment.
Well, that translate into the concept of agency. They have that as part of their as an observer. I mean, and there's some of the interesting things that you're talking about. This whole idea of an observer. Each even each live thing has its own observation, and that is what puts it in sort of geometric space in a sense. That's what would that be correct, or is that the idea that a cell? And I've heard Michael talk about this. Is that you have this sort of each thing has its own observation, and by its observation, it exists, and that is its selfhood, which gives its unique freedom in some sense. Would that be an accurate summary, or where could you go from there?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to think about it. And you mentioned geometry.
Right.
We've been working in a Hilbert space, right? We've been working in this large abstract space of degrees of freedom. And there's no reason that Hilbert space needs to include any spatial degrees of freedom. So with various colleagues, mostly Jim Glazebrook and Antonino Marciano, I've been working on the question of where geometric space comes from. And one can think of geometric space as actually something that only lives on this boundary. The geometric space is part of the system's description of the information flowing in through its boundary. And consequently is also a component of the description of how it acts on or through its boundary, right? The system is acting on its environment, but it's acting through its boundary. And the boundary encodes the information that it can get from its environment, and it also encodes the information it can give its environment. So let me just mention the other very general point about this picture, other than the one about agency, freedom. I think freedom and agency go together. Freedom from local determinism and agency go together. The other point is that this picture is completely symmetrical, right? We've been talking about the system of interest and its environment. But we constructed these by just taking this universe and drawing a boundary across it that had the right kind of characteristics. It wasn't too small and it wasn't too big. It was kind of a Goldilocks boundary, right? So since we constructed it that way, we can label it any way we want to. So I can also say that the system I'm interested in is what I previously called the environment. And the environment of that system is the original system of interest, right? It's a binary, it's a bipartite decomposition. So each of these systems is the environment of the other. Now, that symmetry tells us something very interesting. It tells us that when we're thinking about a system, a cell, a person, a society, any kind of system interacting with its environment, and we treat that as an agent, we treat that thing as having one of these Goldilocks boundaries that's kind of the right size, then the system on the other side obviously has the same boundary. Right? The boundary is completely symmetric. So it has a Goldilocks boundary too. So it's also an agent. And so it is also observing our original system, and it's acting on our original system. And it can learn about the original system only the information that passes through the boundary. So it's completely general to think of system and environment as passing each other finite bit strings across the boundary. And since each of them is an agent, they can assign whatever semantics they want to, whatever sense of actionability, whatever consequences, computational consequences they want to these bit strings. So they don't have a fixed semantics. They have a semantics for the system and a semantics for the environment, and they don't have to be the same.
So one of the things that I came from this a long time ago through the notion of requisite variety, the good regulator theorem. And if I'm just trying to translate into what you're saying from that vantage point, is that in order for something to maintain its independence, it has to have a rich enough description of the external world or the environment, or it'll be controlled by it. In a sense, so that you have this, the law of variety, cardinality, and the number of different things. So sort of in order for independence to be preserved. Um, and as what you're saying is you can't sort of think of an agent independent of some agent in an environment, right? I mean, and that they're they're trying to model each other. Is that would there be and the extent to which they do that, they maintain their independence. Is that would that be an accurate characterization? Or it was because that's part of the selection process that that drives the change and innovation and being able to be. I mean, well, people have said maybe incorrect. It's simplistically that life is entropic. There was an whole idea of neg entropy, but I think that's sort of a simplification of the notion in that in order they have to acquire entropy or variety in order to adapt or maintain their boundaries at levels of complexity. Is this dovetail with what you're saying, or is this a difference? Or I'm trying to reconcile these perspectives.
Yeah, I think that's quite consistent. And in fact, you've stated almost a complete characterization of the free energy principle. So let's talk about that for a minute.
That's right.
The free energy principle is about the conditions under which these boundaries remain stable.
Right.
And it, uh, it just states that a system that remains distinct from its environment must act in a way that preserves the stability of its boundary. Now, that's a tautology, right? That's just a logical implication.
Right. Karl
That's
says that.
that's what we mean by distinctness from the environment.
Right.
And uh, so, again, we can invoke this symmetry and say that the environment, in order for the environment to remain distinct from the system, it has to do exactly the same thing.
Right. Exactly.
It has to act in a way that preserves the stability of this boundary. Now, think about what actually happens in the case of biological systems. I mean, eventually, biological systems, or at least many of them, die.
Right.
Well, what does that mean? It means that the interaction with the environment uh, changes in a way that keeps the number of degrees of freedom of the system fixed, that increases the size of the boundary so that more and more of the degrees of the freedom of the system become directly involved in the interaction with the environment. So think of your environment as kind of exploding in front of your face. What that does is tear your boundary apart.
Right.
And make it very big. It exposes what used to be inside to the outside. And that's what happens when systems just kind of fall apart. So what these systems are, and notice what happens to the environment here.
Yes.
Right? The environment, when the system's no longer distinguishable from the environment, because its interaction is so strong, the environment's now no longer distinguishable from the system, right? The system's been kind of sucked into the environment. So the identities of both of these partners have changed. And we tend to use the word environment in this, objective, observer independent way.
Yes.
And we say, oh, okay, well, that cell died, but that didn't affect the environment. Well, that's just wrong.
I mean, I was brought up. I mean, in the early days, you would have like climbing a fitness landscape. There's this passive thing the agent acted against, but they didn't define each other. And what you're saying is they mutually define each other, and you can't, and that's foundational. And that it seems to be very different from your sort of your traditional classic scientific perspective or objective reality, whatever, is that these things are mutually defining and dynamically shaped by the free energy principle over time, um, which is not your classic understanding of, of, adaptation, of organization, or anything else. It's like, oh, the environment's out there, you act upon it, and then you get something out of it, but you don't mutually shape. So this whole idea of highly interactively, mutually defining things is to me at least a very different and profound different perspective on how to look at any form of quote intelligence, organization, or agency. And as you say, the interface becomes a critical way understanding the nature of the interface and the boundary conditions is sort of key to doing the analytics. I mean, one of the things that interests me is how to design, conscious agents. I know you worked on these concepts with a number of papers on that, but and it's very different than you see what's being done currently in the sort of the agent architectures and artificial intelligence that now exists. And I guess one of the things that I find most intriguing is when you're talking about going from a sort of a Hilbert space or quantum reference field into a classic sort of geometric space. And that's when a thing becomes alive. I'm assuming that's when it assigns its own semantics and is conditioned by its own space-time contingencies, right? I mean, it's a living thing. It has its own biomolecules, its own ways of navigating and keeping alive, in its own as an expression of its own internal degrees of freedom, and that's what a living thing is. But that I'm trying to is that similar to what you're saying, or how would you?
Yeah, I think we can be a little bit slower than that, actually. Uh, if we let's just stay in Hilbert space for a while and uh, think of a system that's interacting with its environment, doing what Karl calls active inference, right? It's trying to learn about its environment. So it has some learning algorithm that allows it to get information from its environment and use that information to update its model of what the environment will do next. But it's also an active agent, so it can act on its environment. In fact, it has to act on its environment. There's no such thing as a one-way interaction. Right? Interaction is two-way by definition. Uh, so the system is always giving information to its environment. And we can think of it from the system's point of view of I'm acting on the environment to see what it will do with the manipulation that I give it, or see what it will do when, remember, for the environment, that's its sensory input, what the system is doing to it.
Right,
So
right.
the system's going to send a message to the environment to see what kind of message it gets back. So the system can actively control the rate of its own learning by acting on the environment to try to generate some novel behavior on the part of the environment. This is starting to sound like science, right?
Yeah, I was going to say that. It's like scientific
uh,
method. Right,
right.
right.
So,
Learning
so,
experiment.
so systems
Okay.
are constantly doing this. They're playing with the environment to see what the environment's going to do. Well, why? Because they want to build a better model of the environment, and simultaneously, the environment's doing that to them as well.
When you use the word environment, would you also with the niche? Is it like niche construction, or or is that separate? And then what you think about as environment?
Yeah, um, think about what niche construction is, right? In Karl's terms, uh, what systems are trying to do is minimize variational free energy, which is surprise,
Right.
basically. It's model mismatch plus surprise. So they're uh, they're acting on their environment locally, in this case, in a way that stabilizes part of what the environment does to the system.
Yeah.
So if I'm doing niche construction, say I'm building a house, right?
Right.
Humans do niche construction all the time.
That's what we do. That's what we do.
Right. Or I'm having a relationship with someone. What I'm doing is acting on part of my world,
Right.
or I'm acting on my world, and and part of it is responding to me by behaving in a very regular way. So my house doesn't surprise me very often, fortunately. I mean, every now and then it does, and then you have a problem. You have to spend money and stuff like that.
Okay.
So yes, niche construction is, in a sense, just the opposite of doing an experiment. When I do an experiment on the world, I want to get some novelty back. If I do niche construction on the world, I want to get stability back. And that's the stability is the niche. So let's think for a moment about memory.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So if I'm this machine learning system, I have this model of the world, and you can think of it as an artificial neural network or something. So it's got a bunch of parameters, and I'm constantly modifying those parameters. But there's another kind of memory that would be very useful for me to have, and that is memory for specific events and the order in which they happened. So suppose I can do niche construction on the world. I can act on the world in a way that generates stability. If I can do that, then I can write some information in a little part of the world that I can rely on being there, right? I can rely on it being stable. So that's, for example, what I do in my lab notebook.
Right.
I write down what happened as a response to certain sorts of probings of the environment, for example. And that's a kind of memory. And in particular, it's stigmergic memory. It's memory that I've written on my environment. And I can't be sure that it's not going to change, just in the same way that I can't be sure that, what I store in my neurons isn't going to change. But I can be pretty confident in it when I come across it again, that in fact, this sentence in my lab notebook is the one that I wrote on whatever date that was. So if I can do that, I can record memory for events by writing them on some stable part of my environment. Okay, now think about that process. If I'm writing on my environment, I'm acting, so I'm doing something that's thermodynamically irreversible as far as I'm concerned, right? The environment might change it, might erase my bit, but I'm not changing it. Okay, so it's thermodynamically irreversible as far as I'm concerned, which means I have to burn some energy to do it. And burning energy takes time. And in fact, I'm not going to be able to regard that as a memory unless it's time-stamped, because I won't know what order it got written in unless I've time-stamped it. So if I'm going to do this memory thing, I have to have a clock. I have to implement a clock internally. Because if it's out in the environment, it's just input to me.
Right.
But an internal clock, something that actually ticks for me, ticks whenever I write in this irreversible way on the environment. So memory and time go together. And we haven't said anything at all about 3D space. We've just constructed time. And notice that time arrow that clock defines is a time arrow for me. It's time relative to me. So if you look at the kind of entropic times that people like Max Tegmark or Carlo Rovelli or other people working in general relativity or quantum gravity are talking about, it's that kind of time relative to me. It's my clock, not something out there. And that's the fundamental time that one can construct in this theory. And if one then introduces communication between different systems along particular kinds of channels, then they can share clocks and things like that. But these internal reference frames are the most important and fundamental. And the first one that you have to construct is time.
So then with that, you have the observer. I mean, then you have the observer becomes aware, I mean, in space and time. And is that when you have the clock and you have the memory that does that frame the identity or the agency or the identity of a thing, of a living thing? Is that the sort of prerequisite that you're saying?
Well, living things that can use stigmergic memory have to have clocks.
Right.
That's what's been said so far. Uh, Now, how do you get space? Let's think about space for a minute. Think about how human infants get space. Okay, they do motor babbling. They they move their limbs around, things like that. Oh, this is mine, right?
That's right.
And I'm doing something. I'm exerting effort to see this visual pattern. So if you think of a system that is interacting with its environment, and on its boundary, it has certain areas of stability, then it can, in effect, associate areas of stability on its boundary in different ways. So if I have an area of stability here and an area of stability down here, then I can put them together or not, right? So here's a pattern on my shirt, and here's my hand. And I can put the hand near the pattern on my shirt or not. And for an infant, that's the beginning of the notion of space, of these coordinates that are in the world.
That's really cool.
And what are they? They're a way of making a correlation between different things that are islands of stability in the environment.
Got it.
And we can think of it all in terms of redundancy, right? John Wheeler again said something along the lines of, there's time in the universe so that everything doesn't happen at once. And there's temporal redundancy, right? Things can happen now and then they can happen later and they can happen later and the same thing can happen later, right? We have this idea of identity over time. And that's what the free energy principle is about preserving, right?
Systems.
Redundancy through time of system environment boundaries. But space is just a way to keep everything from happening on top of each other. So space is a way of allowing a thing to be here and then that same thing to be someplace else. And then that same thing to be someplace else. Right. So it's, again, it's something we use to allow things to have identity under various kinds of manipulations. And in fact, the kinds of manipulations are the manipulations in the Poincaré group, right? Yeah, I can move it from here to there, or I can turn it around, or something like that. Those are the manipulations that preserve identity for us. So time and space are fundamentally about identity and redundancy, being able to have copies. And that's, so we can ask about an organism, when do you start to see organisms that perceive space in the sense of recognizing the identity of something after it's moved? And so they have to be able to perceive the motion, and perceiving motion and perceiving identity obviously go together.
Change time,
I don't know whether E. coli can actually experience space, but I certainly expect that, say, something like paramecium can experience space. Yeah. So you asked a long time ago about this question about explanation. Do you want to hit on that a little bit? Because I think that is fundamental to this whole way of thinking here.
Because it's a whole approach and a whole way of thinking of it in a non-reductive way. So I think that would be good if we could cover that topic and fold it into this because I think it very much comes.
We've talked about this idea that we have some universe of interest and we draw a boundary across it. And if the boundary has certain very simple characteristics, then it serves as statistically a Markov blanket, something that filters information. And it allows the systems on the two sides of it to act using the free energy principle, to be active inference agents that are trying to preserve the stability of their boundary. Now, clearly, we can cut things up in many, many different ways, right? We can have a universe and slice all sorts of boundaries across it and ask which of those boundaries are stable and which ones aren't stable, and et cetera, et cetera. And any way we choose to slice it, the fundamental description of the behavior is the same, right? The fundamental description of the behavior is the systems are behaving so as to minimize variational free energy. They're acting as active inference agents. They're building models of their environment, et cetera. So this whole story gets told regardless of what the boundary looks like, as long as it's one of these Goldilocks boundaries that's not too big and not too small. So this is a real difference from typical kinds of explanations. And if you want to actually bring up figure 5 from that non-reductive explanation talk, that's the one that shows kind of the difference between reductionist or, in fact, emergentist. Those two go together. Explanatory strategies and explanatory strategies that are scale-free. So in the traditional reductionist picture, which goes back to Karl Hempel and Rudolf Carnap and those philosophers of science back in the 1920s and 30s, the basic idea was that the laws or dynamics or mathematical formalism that characterize little things explain the behavior of big things. So big things didn't, in a sense, have their own behavior. They were the composite of the behavior of a lot of little things. And so big things, macroscopic objects or dynamics or whatever, were either emergent or epiphenomenal. And the smallest scale of little things that were of interest is a fundamental scale. So, you talk about things going on at the Planck scale, for example, which is 10 to the minus 35 meters, right? It's the scale at which space and time start to become meaningless in quantum theory. Or one can talk about the scale of elementary particles, which is 15 orders of magnitude bigger than that. Or one can talk about the scale of atoms, which is another 5 to 10 orders of magnitude bigger than that. So you pick some fundamental scale and say, I'm going to describe the universe at that scale, and I've got everything else automatically. And this was Laplace's great idea also back in the 18th century. So the picture that we're talking about is very different from that. It's the picture over on the right side of the screen, where, in fact, little things and big things, so little boundaries and big boundaries, as long as they have the right characteristics, behave in exactly the same way. And those systems, regardless of their scale, are doing basically the same thing. They're all active inference agents. They're all building models of their environment. They're all trying to minimize uncertainty. They're all acting on their environments to try to get more information, et cetera. So they're all doing basically the same thing. You apply the same theory, regardless of scale. So if we think now about what's a big thing, what's a person, for example, or what's a cell, they've they've got lots of little things inside, and the little things are all doing what they do. They're all interacting across their boundaries with their environment. So every cell in my body, for example, is constantly interacting with its environment, which includes, the cells near it, and everything from the cells near it to the edge of the observable universe, right? That's the boundary of some cell in my body. But the part of the boundary that they see pretty directly is just a few neighboring cells plus some chemistry and some electric fields and things like that are longer range. So they're acting on their environments, and their collective action on their environments implements me. But that implementation relation is not a causal relation. It's not something that's specified by a law. It's something that can only really be specified algorithmically. And what the algorithmic specification essentially tells you is that what they're doing is providing the bottom level or the lower level processes required to let me do what I do. So their behavior is allowing me to breathe, for example, and move oxygen around. That would all stop if my cells weren't doing their thing correctly. So we have this much more complicated relationship, which has to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. So go forward to the next slide is not so important. Let's go forward to slide 7. Everyone here will be familiar with this slide. It's from NASA and just illustrates this idea of emergence, which is the standard way of thinking about science and has been for a long time, for about a century now, at any rate. And this new way of thinking about science is on slide 8. It's actually much more complicated. So go, if you would, to slide 8. What it says is that if we have some system that's behaving with respect to its environment, then we can describe that behavior at many different scales. And what we want is a particularly kind of commutativity condition, commutativity in the mathematical sense. As time goes on, we want those two descriptions to relate in the same way. We want to be able to describe it in either way, propagate that description through time, and map the descriptions one to another. And note that this map between descriptions is essentially a kind of semantics. We're asking, what does the scale 1 encoding mean when viewed in scale 2 language, or the other way around? And in fact, this way of working is very familiar. Just go to the next slide. Which one is it? Slide 9. It's just this very same picture expressed in different language. This is what we do in computer science all the time. So, in a sense, computer science is the science of non-reductive explanations. And when we think about the relationship between some high-level description of what a computer is doing and some low-level description of what the same computer is doing, then that relationship is a semantic relationship. It's typically very complicated. We spend a lot of time and effort and money in coding that relationship in computer programs like compilers or program interpreters or operating systems to some extent. And um, it's not any kind of simple emergent story. Um, it's a semantic story. It's a story about the relationship between languages.
Well, could you, having done my work in linguistics and some computation, I'm very interested in your, when you use the word semantics, sort of what you mean by that. And is it a contextually bound mark and definition that is highly contextual and contingent? I mean, how are you using semantics in this sense?
In general, I use the word semantics to um, refer to what information means when operated on in a certain way. And meaning here, um, I'll go back to Bateson's definition of differences that make it
Makes a difference. Yeah,
make a difference.
yeah.
What does that refer to? That refers to actionability. It says, what can I do with this information? And uh, what I can do with the information is in a sense what the information means to me.
Does that mean to me in terms of set of purposes or intentions or outcomes that are important? That links in? There is that teleology in the sense that is embedded in a concept of semantics in that sense.
It's You can use the word teleology as long as it's teleology for me. It's
Yes, yes, yeah,
teleology
yeah,
relative
yeah.
to that
It's a
particular agent.
contextual teleology. It's a bounded contextual teleology, and it cannot be decontextualized, right?
Yeah, uh,
But
and again, the extent to which a system can have goals, have intentions, uh, have some kind of shall we say articulated sense of meaning
yeah,
depends on its memory resources, its
yeah,
ability to uh, write information on its environment, its ability to represent events that have happened previously and go back to those representations and compare them, for example, to what's happening currently. So the idea of context here goes very deep architecturally.
yeah.
So, you know,
Well,
the transistors in your computer uh, don't care about how this bit relates to the last bit they processed. But a
program.
very large collection of transistors that are implementing a particular program,
Do.
at the program level, the program can care about what this number, for example, that's being implemented by a bunch of transistors, how that relates to a previous number.
So when you talk about sort of the same above is below, and then you have these nested relationships, and it uh, is a scale free process. One of the things I wrestle with is you just look at anything that is, and it could be an organization, it could be a cell. Each of those cells have their own unique semantics, context, and yet they also then align around a shared set of contexts or outcomes that creates a larger context that has its own observational identity, and that involves in this. And I'm really interested in sort of how that what the mechanics of that are. I mean, because the particulars of the context of the semantics can be very consequential in terms of whether something works or not. It's like a metabolic pathway; it doesn't work or not. Um, and part of what a living thing is, and being able to navigate all those different, that robustly navigate those pathways in a way to achieve some kind of outcome. Um, and one of the things and we may discuss this earlier that Michael Levin brought up, and you're talking about the butterfly and the caterpillar and then transition between becoming a two-dimensional versus a three-dimensional creature, and the brain gets eliminated, and yet they do retain some notion so there is some memory that persists across that transformation, according to what Mike was saying, and it may be a very coarse grained one because as caterpillars they're eating different kinds of leaves, and as butterflies they're taking nectar. Yet there's a transformation that preserves certain kinds of memory over time. And how does that happen? I mean, what is the where does that get stored and where does it get preserved, and how does that resurrect itself in a sense or resurrect itself? I mean, how does that work in this context?
You're asking a question here that I don't think I know we can't answer in general, and I don't think anyone can answer in that specific case either. And
I mean,
this is in a sense a grand question of biology. How do these integrated systems work? How do these hierarchical architectures work? And I think an important contrast between this case and the computer science case is that we didn't build them, and we're faced with our descriptive tools and our observational tools and our language and thinking about them. And we don't yet, I think, have a very good grip on the adequacy of our descriptive and theoretical concepts for thinking about these kinds of systems. I mean, I was discussing this case with Mike actually in another conversation just a couple of days ago. And we asked this question about the memory, but we could equally well ask this question about the rest of the world, right? The memory is just some sensory input of some kind that we regard as coming from inside because that's what it feels like to us. Goodness knows how the caterpillar or the butterfly regard it. But we can also ask it about any data that we see, any input that we receive through our external senses. We regard these inputs as having a certain kind of stability. We regard them as specifying entities with some sort of identity through time. So, for example, when I look at my laptop, it seems to be the same laptop from one day to the next. And, when I look at you on the video screen, you seem to be the same person that I talked to a couple of weeks ago. And of course, you're not in some fairly obvious physical sense or biological sense. But my classification system, my categorization system, nonetheless take these changes into account. They don't regard the sort of day-to-day changes in my perceptual input as altering the identity of the parts of the world that I'm interacting with. So this again is my sense of time, my sense of continuity through time or identity through time, or redundancy through time. And this sense of identity is a construct, right? It's my cognitive system is constructing this notion of identity. And so constructing this notion of a stable objecthood And it's so the thing that the free energy principle is trying to explain, which is the stability of systems through time, that stability itself is a construct, is a theoretical construct. We view it as just a given fact, but it's not.
Isn't it? Well, so I mean, as you were saying earlier, so you have sort of first-person observations. I mean, so and then you have third-person observations, I assume, and that is. I mean, if you think of this, you're mentioning whether it be a cell or a butterfly. I mean, it's us observing it is different than it as it observes the world, and that is a different construct. Um, but then, how do you get coherence across, you know, the fact that we share a certain set of conventions and constructs basically your identity we're part of this, we share the same protocol in some sense, right? And so therefore we have the same observer space in the sense where we jointly that we agree to. And I assume, and that is what gets constructed. Is that one of the things that gets constructed biologically in order to create greater forms of complexity? Is that how that works?
Yeah, in a sense, we humans are engaged in a project of co-niche construction. And
Right.
uh, language and all the rest of culture is part of that, in that we're um, constantly working with each other as stable components of each of our environments to create more stable components of our shared environment that we can communicate about.
Well, this is where I mean, Carl did a piece on communication and language, and that was sort of I did my doctorate in that area, and in developing a grammar that was based upon what you expected other people to say, and basically recognizing that language is a joint construction. And if you look at the idea of a Creole language or a pidgin, people are, and Carl did these simulations on the brain functioning in order to allow for the adjustment of creating shared concepts. That seems to me be so fundamental as to how social systems are constructed, but that has not been the way that linguistics and cognition and everything is to very recently has looked at these problems. I mean, language is some of the third person view. It's not two people creating a shared reality, a shared language. But from what I'm seeing, I'm seeing that the idea of agents coming together and creating a synthetic language is attractable in a language that has full capacity of a natural language. It's not limited. It's a full expression. I see this approach enabling that, and I think, and I suspect that's something we're going to see in new kinds of synthetic agents being able to create a fully expressive natural language. Is that consistent with some of the things that you're seeing or thinking, or this particular approach?
Yeah, well, I think I would say we, including Karl and Mike, and of course many other people,
Right, right,
are very interested in this idea of communication between agents that may be similar, may not be very similar, and uh, what what are they expressing in whatever communication systems they're already using, they've already figured out how to
right,
use.
right,
And we can ask that question at the cellular level. We can ask that question kind of at the uh, bodily level when we think about something like morphogenesis.
yes, morphogen,
We can ask that question at the social level when we think about multiple organisms. We can ask it at the cross species level when we think about how people communicate with their dogs, for example. Um, and uh, we can certainly think about how do we build artificial models of of this kind of process,
Right.
in which we ask systems that may be constructs to develop some sort of information exchange protocols, right? At the end of the day, it's just bit strings being passed back and forth, whether they're visual, body language, or anything else. So it's a question of bit string exchange protocols in which there is a shared semantics, okay? So in which there's some shared idea of actionability, what you do with this bit string.
Yeah, it's really important.
And
Action building.
that requires some sense of a shared perceptible world, a world outside of those bit strings being used for communication. There's a bunch of other input and a bunch of other output. And those input-output relationships also have to be largely shared in order for the language to be about anything for the agents that are involved in this. And there's one question that has to do with the protocols, right? How do these protocols get negotiated? But that question sits on top of an earlier question about how this, shall we say, co-actionability of other parts of the world gets negotiated. And again, if we go back to human infants, right, we can see some of this in how adults interact with offspring, not only in us but other species.
Well, what's interesting in linguistics is if you take two different groups who have never seen each other, and they come together, and a pidgin language gets formed through a trade exchange. I mean, talk about actionability in reference to the world. Um, its ability to basically they're trying to trade, they identify objects, the utility of objects that allows them to exchange some units of value, and on top of that, then you evolve more complex pidgin language, then a full social structure of the language, and that comes out of that. Um, but it seems to be a natural occurrence, and I guess in sort of the what we began with here is a sort of like this is a very profoundly novel perspective on how to look at the world, look at intelligence, and it is a significant departure from the traditional objectivist reductionist method that I think is pervasive now. Still, I mean, maybe you may disagree with that, but it seems to be embedded in culturally embedded and institutionally embedded. Uh, and then what does it take in order to make that transition, to make that, you're looking at a Kuhnian sense of a paradigm, you have a normal science, and then you have a new science come out of this. What is your sense that, in your experience, I mean, that it facilitates, accelerates that transition? I mean, I can see that the success of a lot of the work that you're doing, that Michael and Karl was doing, is actually real success. May accelerate it, but you still seem to have there still seems to be this mindset. And I'd be interested in your take of how do you see those changes taking place, or what experiments, what things need to be done in order to transition to this very different way of looking at things.
Well, I would say everything we've discussed today is at the level of thinking tools, cognitive tools, bits of language, bits of mathematical formalism that are really essentially just conceptual and linguistic tools. And I think what we will see gradually, probably, is a recognition that these ways of describing things have actual utility for designing experiments.
Yes. Oops.
And to just give an example, and Mike Levin, I'm sure, can say much more about this than I can. Very many notions from economics and sociology are being applied in cell biology or developmental biology. Notions of competition and cooperation have been applied for a long time.
Yeah.
But, and notions of an energy economy have been used for a long time in thinking about how cells interact with each other. But now we're starting to see language, the language of persuasion and deception and convincing and coercing being used at the cellular level to talk about how cells are interacting. And the use of that kind of economic or sociological language makes one perhaps think of different kinds of experiments to be done. And it's the utility in thinking about how to query the world, how to do an experiment.
Exactly.
That is what makes or breaks a set of thinking tools. So the real test of all of these concepts is, does it improve our ability to act on the world in a way that's informative, to put it in this same language that we've been using? Exactly. And I think that's happening.
Yeah.
It's perhaps happening slowly, but
it's happening more slowly than I would expect. But I think the whole whereas it's coming to a head is like the whole field of quote artificial intelligence is exploding, and actually you're having this very explicit. So suddenly these things are implicit now explicit. You can run these huge models. I think that's and I think as this way of thinking permeates that that whole field, I think you're going to see some really interesting experiments and shifts in how things are looked at. Um, and I think this whole inside out biological perspective, the foundations that you're talking about, which you're really looking at things communicating across boundaries and being able to model one another and recognizing those interdependencies and the different points of observation. I mean, this is not part of the normal the traditional conversation in quote AI, but I think that it is now moving into it, and also how to think about organizations and economic systems from this perspective is very rich, and I really appreciate your taking the time to share your ideas and insights with us. This is really very helpful and foundational, and so from first principles point of view, I think we sort of laid a foundation here. Again, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, John. It's very interesting to participate in this process with you, and I do hope that as you move this forward, you'll see more and more answers to this last question you posed to me from people who are a little bit closer to the experimental world.
Well, I mean, what I find so exciting about this, and having been in the field of quote AI for quote many years, I mean, and it was just going nowhere for a long time. Same thing with linguistics, and now there's this sudden explosion of things. It's like every week you're looking at something, and Michael's work, your work, Karl's work, and others. It's just new and new insights, but it's seeing the world through a very different prism than is our current cultural institutional framework. And I think we're really hampered by our being locked into this current framework, and we need to transition to something as rich as this. So that's my mission, as it were. So again, thank you.
All right, thank you.
All right,
Hopefully, we'll
all
all
right.
contribute to doing that.
Okay.
Okay,
All right.
ciao.